In the rain, wet and without hope, Ayla Bennett surrendered herself into the arms of a mysterious man who took her to his luxury penthouse. Little did she know that the man, Connor Martinez, wasn't just a stranger. He was the powerful billionaire judge. If you love romance stories, subscribe to the channel and join our family. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. The night had promised magic, a symphony of clinking glasses and low, appreciative murmurs as Ayla's voice, smoky and rich like aged whiskey, filled the velvet-draped lounge of the Azure Club. She sang of love found and love lost, her notes weaving through the opulent air, a temporary balm for the city's restless souls. But outside, the sky was tearing itself apart. The rain didn't just fall. It assaulted the city, a relentless barrage that turned streets into rivers and whispered promises of ruin. When her set was over, the applause felt like a distant echo, drowned out by the storm's fury and the sudden, sickening vibration of her phone with a message from her landlord. The ground floor was flooding, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the storm's violent percussion. She rushed from the warmth of the club into the chaos, the biting wind and water stealing her breath. Her small basement apartment, her sanctuary filled with sheet music, worn playbills, and the scent of her mother's favorite lavender soap, was submerged in murky, invasive water. Everything she owned, every tangible piece of her past and every tool for her future was gone, swallowed by the deluge. She stood there, the rain plastering her thin dress to her skin, a solitary figure of despair against the backdrop of a world dissolving. It was in that moment of absolute surrender, when a sob tore from her throat, that a long, black car glided to a silent stop beside her. The rear door opened, revealing a cavern of quiet, leather-scented darkness. A man stepped out, a tall, imposing silhouette holding a wide black umbrella that seemed to command its own pocket of stillness amidst the tempest. He didn't speak, but his presence was a statement of authority, his expensive, dark suit somehow repelling the rain. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his eyes dark and unreadable. Yet they held a flicker of something she couldn't name. He simply extended a hand, a gesture that was not a question but a quiet command. There was no menace in it, only an unnerving certainty. Ayla, shivering, her mind a numb landscape of loss, found herself looking at his strong, steady hand as if it were a lifeline. The world had just been ripped from under her, leaving her with nothing but the soaked clothes on her back and the hollow ache of grief. This stranger, a phantom emerging from the storm, offered an escape from the immediate cold, a momentary reprieve from the relentless rain. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to cling to the last vestiges of her independence, but her body betrayed her, numb with cold and shock. His gaze held hers, and in its depth she saw not pity, but a profound, almost solemn understanding that disarmed her completely. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the drumming of the downpour on his umbrella. It felt as if he could see straight through her facade of strength, down to the terrified artist who had just lost her entire world in a torrent of muddy water. She looked from his hand back to the ruin of her home, the place where she had dreamt her dreams and nursed her heartbreaks. There was nothing left for her there. With a shuddering breath that felt like giving up and holding on all at once, she placed her trembling, ice-cold fingers into his warm, firm grasp. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt of life in the midst of so much loss, a silent, binding agreement that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. He gently guided her into the back of the car, the door closing with a soft, heavy thud that sealed out the storm and the life she had known. As the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the flooded street behind, Ayla stared out the rain-streaked window, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't know his name or where he was taking her, or why he had chosen to stop for her, a half-drowned singer on the edge of ruin. All she knew was the feeling of his presence beside her, a solid, silent anchor in the storm of her life. She realized she was stepping into a story she didn't understand, led by a man whose silence was deeper than the ocean. The journey was a blur of smeared city lights and the hypnotic rhythm of the windshield wipers. Ayla remained wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket the man had retrieved from a hidden compartment, its impossible softness a stark contrast to her drenched, ruined dress. She sat rigidly, a million questions screaming in her mind, yet an exhausted silence held her captive. Her host, Connor Martinez, did not press her for conversation. He simply sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the rain-lashed world outside, his profile looking as if it were carved from stone, a study in controlled, quiet power. The silence in the car wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with unspoken things. They arrived at a sleek, impossibly tall glass tower that pierced the stormy sky, a monument to wealth and influence. A private elevator ascended with a whisper, opening directly into a space that stole Ayla's breath. It wasn't an apartment. It was a kingdom in the clouds. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic, godlike view of the storm-ravaged city below, its lights glittering like a scattered handful of diamonds. The decor was a masterpiece of masculine elegance, dark woods, supple leather and cold-polished chrome, all softened by a warm, ambient light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Connor moved through the space with an easy, familiar grace, his presence filling the vast rooms. He led her to a guest suite that was larger than her entire lost apartment. A cavernous bathroom of black marble awaited, with a rainfall shower and a collection of expensive, subtly scented oils and soaps. He had placed a set of soft, new clothes on the king-sized bed, a simple silk pajama set and a thick plush robe. It was all done with a detached efficiency that was both comforting and deeply intimidating. He was solving her problems with the casual ease of a man for whom problems were merely inconveniences to be managed. "Rest," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the quiet air. It was the first word he'd spoken directly to her since they'd left the curb. He stood in the doorway, a formidable figure who seemed to belong to this world of silent luxury as much as she felt alien to it. "We can talk in the morning. Nothing can be solved tonight." His gaze lingered on her for a moment, a brief, unreadable assessment before he turned and left, the door clicking softly shut behind him. Left alone, Ayla felt the full weight of the night crash down on her. She walked on trembling legs to the vast window, looking down at the city she loved, now a wounded, weeping landscape. Up here, the storm was a silent movie, a beautiful, terrible spectacle. The opulence surrounding her felt like a cage, a beautiful prison that highlighted everything she wasn't. She was a singer of smoky bars, a creature of emotion and chaotic creativity. This place was about control, order, and a level of wealth she couldn't comprehend. The hot water of the shower felt like a benediction, washing away the filth of the flood, but not the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She slipped into the silk pajamas, the fabric a cool caress against her skin, and felt a pang of such profound dislocation it nearly brought her to her knees. She was wearing a stranger's clothes in a stranger's home, her own life a submerged memory. Who was this man who could pluck a woman from a disaster and place her in a palace, all without a word of explanation? She padded barefoot across the thick rug, the silence of the penthouse amplifying the frantic beating of her own heart. She was safe, she was warm, she was dry, and she had never felt more lost in her entire life. She was a guest in a gilded cage, cared for by a silent warden whose motives were a complete mystery. The gratitude she felt was tangled with a deep, unsettling fear of the unknown, of the debt she was incurring with every breath she took in his rarefied air. She wondered what he wanted from her, this silent savior who moved with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Ayla awoke to the soft, grey light of dawn filtering through the automated blinds, which had silently retracted to reveal a city washed clean by the storm. For a blissful, fleeting moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed was a cloud of high thread-count linens, and the air was still and quiet, carrying the faint scent of rain and something else, something clean and masculine, like cedar and bergamot. Then, the memories of the previous night rushed back in a sickening wave. The flood, the loss, the imposing stranger, this impossibly luxurious room. She was adrift, a castaway on an island of wealth. She found Connor in a vast open-plan living area, standing before the wall of windows with a ceramic mug cradled in his hands. He was already dressed in a crisp, dark grey suit, though he wore no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone. He looked less like a phantom of the storm, and more like what he was, a man of immense power and discipline, at home in his sky-high fortress. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, adding a touch of distinguished gravity to his already formidable presence. He turned as he sensed her presence, his dark eyes meeting hers with the same unnerving intensity as before. "Good morning," he said, his voice as calm and steady as the new day. There's coffee. I wasn't sure how you took it." He gestured to a sleek chrome machine that looked more like a scientific instrument than a coffee maker. The simple domestic offer was so at odds with the sheer grandeur of the setting and the mystery of the man himself that Ayla could only manage a small, hesitant nod. She felt painfully out of place in her borrowed silk pajamas, her bare feet cold against the polished marble floor. He poured her a mug, his movements economical and precise, and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed, a brief accidental contact that sent a surprising jolt of warmth through her system. "I've made some calls," he continued, turning his gaze back to the city below. "Your building has been condemned. The damage is too extensive. I've arranged for a service to retrieve anything salvageable, but from what the initial reports say, you should prepare yourself for the worst." He delivered the devastating news with a calm detachment that was both chilling and strangely merciful. There was no pity, only facts. Ayla sank onto a plush leather sofa, the warm mug a fragile anchor in the fresh storm of grief that news unleashed. It was one thing to see the water. It was another to hear the finality in his words. Condemned. The word echoed in the silent, cavernous space. She had nothing. No home, no possessions, no security. She was utterly dependent on the kindness of this enigmatic stranger, who spoke of ruin as if it were a line item on a balance sheet. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek, and she hastily wiped it away, embarrassed to show such vulnerability in front of him. He didn't offer false platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, he sat in an armchair opposite her, the vast expanse of the room between them, and simply said, "You can stay here, for as long as you need to get back on your feet. There's more than enough space." It wasn't offered with warmth, but with a quiet, indisputable logic. He saw a problem, her homelessness, and he provided a solution. It was practical, generous, and it made her feel impossibly small, like a charity case he had taken on. She looked at him, truly looked at him, trying to see past the expensive suit and the aura of untouchable authority. His dark eyes were watching her, not with judgment, but with an unwavering, analytical focus. He was a puzzle she couldn't begin to solve, a man of staggering contradictions. He had saved her from the storm, only to place her in a different kind of turmoil, one of obligation and uncertainty, in a world so far removed from her own that it felt like another planet. Accepting his help felt like losing another piece of herself, yet she knew she had no other choice. The first few days in Connor's penthouse passed in a strange, surreal haze. Ayla moved through the opulent rooms like a ghost, dwarfed by the high ceilings and the vast empty spaces. The silence was the most intimidating part. It was a dense, heavy silence, the kind that only true wealth can buy, insulated from the noise of the city below. It was broken only by the soft hum of the climate control, the distant chime of an elevator, or Connor's quiet, measured footsteps on the marble floors. He was a creature of routine and discipline, leaving early in the morning and returning late in the evening, his days shrouded in a mystery she didn't dare to probe. She spent her time navigating the awkward reality of her new existence. Connor had given her a credit card with a staggering limit for essentials, an act of generosity that felt more like a transaction and left a bitter taste of dependence in her mouth. She bought a few simple outfits, toiletries, a new journal, but the act of spending his money felt like a betrayal of her own identity. She tried to make herself useful, keeping the already immaculate space tidy, but it felt like a futile gesture. A cleaning service, as silent and efficient as their employer, came twice a week, leaving no trace of their presence save for the scent of lemon and polish. The proximity between them was a constant low-grade hum of tension. They were two strangers sharing a home, orbiting each other in a careful, polite dance of avoidance. They would sometimes cross paths in the morning, a quiet exchange of good morning over coffee, or in the evening, a brief nod as he retreated to his home office. A room she had only glimpsed, lined from floor to ceiling with imposing law books. He never asked about her past, and she never asked about his present. Their conversations were a barren landscape of polite, impersonal inquiries about her comfort. One afternoon, desperate for a sense of normalcy, Ayla found herself in the grand living area, drawn to the magnificent black grand piano that stood like a sleeping giant in the corner. She hadn't sung not a single note since the night of the storm. The music felt trapped inside her, silenced by the loss and the strangeness of her situation. Hesitantly, she sat on the polished bench, her fingers hovering over the cool ivory keys. She felt like an intruder, a trespasser about to defile a sacred object in this temple of silence. She began to play, a soft, melancholic melody that she had composed herself, a tune filled with the sorrow and uncertainty that clouded her heart. Then tentatively she began to sing. Her voice, at first a mere whisper, grew in strength and confidence, filling the vast, silent space with a wave of raw, aching emotion. She poured all her grief, her fear, and her loneliness into the song. Her eyes closed, losing herself in the one thing that had always been hers, the one thing the flood could not wash away. She was so lost in the music that she didn't hear him come in. When the final note faded into the stillness, she opened her eyes to find Connor standing in the archway, his briefcase in hand. He hadn't moved. He was just watching her, his usually impassive face holding an expression of stark, unguarded astonishment. For the first time she saw a crack in his formidable armor, a flicker of something deeply human and vulnerable in his dark, unreadable eyes. He had seen a part of her soul, and she knew with a sudden, heart-stopping certainty that nothing between them would ever be the same. The moment stretched, suspended in the echo of the final note. The surprise on Connor's face slowly receded, replaced by an intense, focused curiosity that felt more unnerving than his usual detachment. He didn't speak, but he walked slowly into the room, placing his briefcase on a side table with a soft, deliberate click. He moved toward the piano, not taking his eyes off her, his gaze holding a new weight, a new meaning. Isla's heart hammered in her chest. She felt exposed, as if her song had stripped her bare, revealing every secret and sorrow she held inside. "I didn't know you played," he said, his voice a low rumble that did little to calm her frayed nerves. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't praise either. It was a simple statement of fact, a recalibration of his understanding of her. He had seen her as a victim of circumstance, a problem to be solved. Now he was seeing her as an artist, a creator of a beauty so profound it had stopped him in his tracks. "Your voice. It's—" He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for the precise, analytical words he was used to. "It's how I make my living," Ayla replied, her voice barely a whisper. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "Or how I used to." The reminder of her former life, of singing in smoky lounges for appreciative strangers, felt like a lifetime ago. Here in this sterile, silent penthouse, her music felt like an untamed, wild thing, something emotional and messy and out of place. She suddenly felt the need to apologize for the intrusion, for filling his quiet sanctuary with her loud, heartfelt sadness. Instead of retreating back into his shell of polite distance, Connor surprised her. He leaned against the piano, his proximity sending a shiver of awareness through her. "Tell me about it," he said, a simple invitation that felt monumental. He wasn't dismissing her or her art. He was, for the first time, asking to be let in. So hesitantly at first, and then with a growing sense of release, she told him. She spoke of her passion for music, the thrill of holding a room captive with just her voice, the dreams she had of writing her own songs, of telling her own stories. As she spoke, she saw another crack appear in his controlled facade. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his gaze never leaving her face. He wasn't just hearing the words, he was absorbing them. She realized this man, who lived a life of such order and logic, was captivated by her world of chaotic emotion and raw creativity. It was as if she were speaking a foreign language he had never heard, but somehow instinctively understood. He was a man of facts and precedents, and she was a woman of feelings and melodies. The conversation shifted, and he began to speak of his own world, not in specifics, but in abstracts. He spoke of the weight of responsibility, the demand for absolute certainty, the loneliness of making decisions that held immense consequences. He didn't mention his profession, but Ayla got a sense of a life lived under immense pressure, a world where emotion was a liability. She saw a flicker of a deep, profound loneliness in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, and her heart gave an unexpected, painful lurch of empathy. He was a man trapped in his own gilded cage, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to reach out and set him free. The following evening, the delicate truce of their new understanding was tested. Driven by a restless energy, and a deep-seated need to contribute something to the household that wasn't paid for by his limitless credit card, Ayla decided to cook. She had found a surprisingly well-stocked pantry and refrigerator, filled with gourmet ingredients that spoke of a life catered to, not lived in. She chose to make a simple, rustic pasta dish from a recipe her grandmother had taught her, something that smelled of garlic, basil, and home. The kitchen, a sleek and sterile expanse of stainless steel and marble, soon filled with the warm, chaotic aromas of her cooking. It was a stark contrast to the usual quiet, scentless air of the penthouse. She put on some soft jazz from her phone, the music a gentle rebellion against the oppressive silence. For the first time since she had arrived, a corner of this vast, intimidating space began to feel like hers. She was creating something, not with her voice but with her hands, infusing the cold, modern space with a bit of her own warmth. Connor arrived home to the unfamiliar sounds and smells. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. Ayla, her hair messily tied up, a dusting of flour on her cheek, swaying slightly to the music, as she stirred a bubbling pot of tomato sauce. She looked vibrant and alive, a splash of brilliant, beautiful color against his monochromatic world. He had grown so accustomed to the silence, he hadn't realized how empty it was until this very moment. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her voice a little breathless as she turned to face him. "I wanted to thank you for everything." She gestured vaguely with the sauce-covered spoon, a small endearing smile playing on her lips. "It's not much," but her voice trailed off, a hint of her usual insecurity creeping back in. She was offering him a simple, home-cooked meal, a peasant's feast in a king's palace, and she was suddenly terrified he would see it as a paltry, meaningless gesture. He surprised her again. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips, a rare event that transformed his severe, handsome features, making him look younger, more approachable. "It smells incredible," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He shed his suit jacket, tossing it over a chair with uncharacteristic carelessness, and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing strong, capable forearms. "Can I help?" The question hung in the air, another monumental offering from this man of quiet control. They worked together in the confined space behind the kitchen island, a universe away from the formal distance they usually maintained. Their bodies brushed against each other as they moved, sending little shocks of electricity through Ayla's skin. She was acutely aware of his height, of the clean, masculine scent of him, of the way his large, steady hands looked as he chopped vegetables with surprising skill. The air grew thick with more than just the steam from the pasta. It was charged with an unspoken, palpable chemistry that left her breathless. They ate not at the massive, formal dining table, but at the small breakfast bar, the city lights twinkling below them. The conversation was easy, flowing, stripped of the polite armor they usually wore. They talked about favorite foods, travel, childhood memories. It was normal. It was easy. And in that moment of shared, simple intimacy, surrounded by the aroma of garlic and basil, Ayla felt a dangerous, terrifying flutter in her chest. She was starting to feel at home here, and she knew that could only lead to a broken heart. A few nights later, the lingering trauma of the flood resurfaced, invading Ayla's sleep with a vengeance. She dreamt she was back in her apartment, the water rising around her, cold and suffocating. Sheet music dissolved into pulp in her hands. The keys of her small keyboard floated past like tiny coffins, and the menacing, murky water filled her lungs, choking the very breath, the very music from her body. She awoke with a strangled gasp, sitting bolt upright in bed, her body trembling, her borrowed silk pajamas clinging to her skin with cold sweat. The phantom sensation of drowning was so real she could barely breathe. The scream that had escaped her was little more than a choked whisper, but in the profound silence of the penthouse, it was as loud as a siren. A moment later, a soft knock came at her door, followed by Connor's low, concerned voice. "Ayla, are you all right?" He didn't wait for a response, but opened the door slowly, stepping into the darkness of her room. He was a tall, broad silhouette against the ambient light from the hallway, dressed in a simple t-shirt and pajama pants, a far more casual and vulnerable image than she was used to. She couldn't speak, could only wrap her arms around herself, trying to stop the violent shivering. He didn't turn on the light, for which she was grateful. Instead, he moved quietly to the side of the bed and sat on the edge, maintaining a respectful distance. yet his presence was a solid, calming weight in the tumultuous darkness. "A nightmare?" he asked gently, his voice a soothing balm on her raw nerves. She could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. He didn't offer empty platitudes like, it was only a dream. Instead, he just sat with her in the quiet, his stillness a powerful anchor against the storm raging inside her. After a long moment he began to speak, his voice low and steady, telling her about the city below them. He described the way the lights of the bridges reflected on the dark water of the river, the endless stream of headlights moving along the expressways, the silent, sleeping lives in the buildings all around them. He wasn't distracting her. He was grounding her, pulling her out of the suffocating water of her dream and back into the solid reality of the here and now. His voice was a lifeline. Ayla found herself focusing on its deep, calm cadence, letting it wash over her, cleansing the fear and panic from her mind. The trembling slowly subsided, and her breathing evened out. She felt the tight knot of terror in her chest begin to loosen. He didn't touch her, didn't offer a physical comfort that might have crossed a line, yet she felt more cared for, more protected in that moment than she had in a very long time. His respect for her space was a form of intimacy all its own. He stayed until the first hints of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, his quiet monologue about the city, a gentle lullaby for her fractured soul. When he finally stood to leave, the room was no longer dark but filled with a soft, promising light. "Try to get some more sleep," he said, his voice barely a whisper at the door. She watched him go, this man of immense control and hidden depths, who had calmed her storm without so much as touching her hand. She felt a sense of safety with him that was profound, and it terrified her more than any nightmare. The next morning, Connor announced, in his typical matter-of-fact way, that they were going out. It wasn't a suggestion. Ayla, still feeling fragile from the nightmare, was hesitant, but he was insistent, a quiet determination in his eyes that she was beginning to recognize. He explained that she couldn't live in borrowed clothes forever, that she needed things that were hers, a small step toward rebuilding the life she had lost. The logic was sound, but the thought of him accompanying her, of him witnessing her vulnerability as she picked out the mundane necessities of life, was daunting. He took her not to a sprawling, impersonal mall, but to a quiet, discreet street lined with elegant, exclusive boutiques. It was a world she had only ever glimpsed from the outside, a world of hushed reverence for fabric and design. At first she felt like an imposter, painfully aware of her borrowed clothes and her empty bank account. She picked at simple, inexpensive items, her choices dictated by a lifetime of budgeting and a fierce, ingrained pride that chafed at the idea of accepting his charity. Connor watched her, a silent, observant presence a few steps behind. He saw her hesitation, the way she checked the price tags with a worried frown, the way she put back a beautiful woolen coat after a moment's longing touch. With a quiet word to a sales assistant, he made his own selections. He wasn't buying her frivolous, extravagant things. He chose items of quality and timeless elegance, soft cashmere sweaters, well-cut jeans, a pair of practical and beautiful leather boots, a simple, classic black dress. They were things meant to last, things that offered comfort and dignity. A small argument brewed between them amongst the racks of designer clothes. "I can't let you do this," Ayla whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of gratitude and humiliation. "This is too much." Connor simply met her gaze, his own unwavering. "Let me do this, Ayla," he said, his voice low and firm, meant only for her. "This is not charity. Think of it as a necessary investment in your peace of mind. You cannot begin to rebuild your life if you are worried about what you will wear tomorrow." His reframing of the act, from charity to a practical necessity, chipped away at her defenses. She saw then that his generosity wasn't about control, but about care. He was a man who solved problems, and he saw her lack of a wardrobe as a problem that was hindering her recovery. As she reluctantly allowed him to pay, she noticed something else, a subtle, almost imperceptible possessiveness in his demeanor, the way he stood slightly closer to her when a male assistant complimented her, the way his hand briefly rested on the small of her back to guide her through a doorway. He was staking a silent, protective claim. Later, sitting in a quiet, sunlit cafe, the table between them covered in elegant shopping bags, they spoke more freely than ever before. He asked her about her family, and she told him about her parents, both gone now, who had instilled in her a love of music and a stubborn streak of independence. In return, he offered a rare, fleeting glimpse into his own past, speaking of a childhood governed by expectation and duty, a path laid out for him before he could even walk. It wasn't a complaint, just a statement of fact, but it hinted at a profound, lifelong loneliness. She saw the man behind the billionaire, the boy who had been taught to value control above all else, and her heart ached for him. A week later, Ayla received a call that felt like a lifeline back to her old self. It was from the manager of the Azure Club. The lounge had been largely undamaged by the storm and was reopening. He wanted her back for her regular weekend slot, starting that Friday. A jolt of pure, unadulterated joy shot through her. It was more than just a job. It was a chance to reclaim her identity, to be Ayla Bennett, the singer, not Ayla Bennett, the rescued woman living in a billionaire's penthouse. Her excitement was so palpable, it was almost a physical thing. When she told Connor the news that evening, she expected him to be pleased, to offer a polite, detached congratulations. Instead, his reaction was more complex. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Was it concern? Displeasure? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze analytical as he watched her pace the living room, buzzing with a nervous energy he had never seen in her before. She was so beautifully, vibrantly alive in that moment, and the thought of her returning to that world of late nights and anonymous admirers stirred a deeply protective, unfamiliar instinct within him. "I'd like to be there," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ayla stopped pacing, surprised. "You at the Azure Club?" The idea was jarring. She couldn't picture him, with his severe suits and his aura of quiet authority, sitting in a dimly lit, crowded lounge, listening to her sing songs of heartbreak and desire. His world was one of silent boardrooms and imposing offices, not velvet curtains and cocktails. "You don't have to do that," she said, a little flustered. "It's my work." "It's different. I want to see you," he insisted, his voice softening slightly. "I've heard you sing for me. I want to see you sing for the world." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't about supervising her. It was about witnessing her in her element, seeing the part of her she had spoken of with such passion. A part of her was thrilled at the thought of him seeing her shine, of proving that she was more than the damsel in distress he had rescued. But another, more vulnerable part of her was terrified. Singing for him in the quiet of his home was one thing. Bearing her soul on a stage with his intense analytical gaze upon her was another entirely. The days leading up to the performance were filled with a new kind of tension. It was the nervous, exciting energy of an artist preparing for a show, but it was tangled with her complex feelings for Connor. She practiced in the living room, the grand piano now a familiar friend, and she was always aware of him, listening from his office, the door left slightly ajar. He never interrupted, never commented, but his silent presence was a constant, powerful force pushing her to be better, to be bolder. On Friday night, as she got ready, she chose the simple, elegant black dress he had bought for her. It felt like a suit of armor, a symbol of the strange new life she was living. When she emerged from her room, she found him waiting, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He looked devastatingly handsome, a man who commanded attention without ever demanding it. His eyes raked over her, a slow, appreciative appraisal that made her skin tingle and her heart beat a little faster. As they rode down in the silent elevator, the unspoken anticipation was a living thing between them. Tonight, their two worlds would finally collide. The Azure Club was exactly as Ayla remembered it, yet seeing it through Connor's eyes, it felt different. The low, intimate lighting, the scent of expensive perfume and aged spirits, the sophisticated murmur of the crowd. It was her natural habitat, but with him by her side, she felt the stark contrast between her world and his. He moved through the space with an effortless authority, securing a secluded candlelit table in the corner that offered a perfect view of the small stage. He was an island of calm, formidable stillness in the sea of social chatter. As Ayla left him to go backstage, his hand briefly found hers, his fingers giving her a firm, reassuring squeeze. "Break a leg," he murmured, his voice a low, private encouragement that was for her alone. The simple, classic phrase coming from him felt incredibly intimate. Backstage, her nerves were a chaotic flutter of butterflies in her stomach. It wasn't just stage fright. It was Connor fright. Knowing he was out there watching, listening, analyzing, changed everything. She felt a desperate need to impress him, to show him the full force of her talent. When the spotlight found her on stage, she took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the dim room until she found him. He was leaning forward slightly, his attention completely and utterly fixed on her. The rest of the club, the entire world, seemed to fade away into a muted background. There was only him. She had planned to open with an upbeat, crowd-pleasing number, but in that moment, another song came to her heart, a soulful, aching ballad about finding an unexpected light in the darkness. She sang it for him. Every note, every word, every pained and hopeful inflection was a message sent directly to their corner table. She poured all of her complicated feelings into the melody, her gratitude, her confusion, her fear, and the terrifying, burgeoning affection that she was no longer able to deny. Her voice soared through the room, filled with a raw, vulnerable power she had never accessed before. She was laying her soul bare for him, for everyone to see. The room fell silent, captivated by the raw emotion of the performance. Connor did not move. He was mesmerized, his carefully constructed walls of control crumbling before the sheer, unadorned beauty of her voice and the story it told. He was a man who dealt in evidence and facts, and here was the undeniable truth of her heart, presented as a song. He felt a powerful, possessive surge of emotion, so intense it almost knocked the breath from his lungs. In that moment, he wasn't a powerful man of influence. He was just a man, completely and irrevocably captivated by a woman singing on a stage. When the final, trembling note faded into a stunned silence, followed by a wave of explosive applause, Ayla's eyes were still locked on his. She saw it then in the dark, unguarded depths of his gaze, the same raw, overwhelming emotion she felt in her own heart. He had not just heard her song, he had understood it. He had understood every unspoken word, every hidden meaning. It was a confession, and in his eyes she saw that it was one he fully accepted. The performance had changed everything. A truth had been spoken in melody that could never be unsaid. The ride back to the penthouse was a study in exquisite tension. The silence that filled the car was not the awkward, polite silence of their first days together, but a heavy, charged stillness, thick with unspoken emotions and the lingering echoes of her song. Ayla sat staring out at the blurred city lights, her heart still thrumming with adrenaline from the performance. She could feel Connor's gaze on her, an intense, searing heat that made her skin tingle. She was acutely aware of the small space between them, a chasm of possibility and fear. When they entered the penthouse, the silence followed them, amplified by the vast, empty space. Ayla walked towards the floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms wrapped around herself as she looked down at the glittering city. She could hear him behind her, the soft sound of his shoes on the marble floor, the quiet click as he placed his keys on a side table. He didn't speak, and the waiting, the anticipation was a sweet, unbearable torture. She had laid her heart bare on that stage, and now she braced herself for the fallout. He came to stand beside her, his reflection a tall, dark shape next to hers in the glass. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that vibrated through the air between them. It wasn't a simple compliment. It was a statement of profound awe. He turned to face her, and she was forced to meet his gaze. The analytical coolness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, burning intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked at her as if he were a starving man and she were a feast. "Ayla," he breathed her name, and it was both a question and a prayer. He slowly raised his hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited a fire that had been smoldering between them for weeks. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch impossibly tender for such a powerful, controlled man. Every rational thought in Ayla's head evaporated, replaced by a singular, overwhelming need, and then he lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a release, a surrender to the weeks of pent-up tension, unspoken attraction, and undeniable connection. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, filled with all the things they hadn't been able to say. His other hand came up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, staking his claim. Ayla melted against him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders as she returned the kiss with equal, unrestrained fervor. It was a kiss of collision, of two worlds, two lonely souls finally crashing into one another. It was the rain and the storm, the silence and the music, the luxury and the loss, all culminating in this single explosive moment of contact. His lips were firm and demanding, yet they were also searching, asking a question she was more than ready to answer. She poured all of her longing, her gratitude, and her blossoming love into her response, letting him taste the truth of her song on her lips. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, they simply stared at each other, the air crackling between them. The dam had broken. The world seemed to tilt and then resettle on a new axis. The aftermath of the kiss left them both breathless, standing in the soft glow of the city lights, the air between them thick and electric. Isla's lips tingled, her entire body humming with a strange new energy. Connor's dark eyes, usually so guarded, were wide with a raw, undisguised vulnerability that mirrored her own. The fortress of control he had so carefully built around himself had been breached, and he seemed just as stunned by it as she was. He started, his voice rougher than usual, then stopped, as if the words he was used to, logical, precise and impersonal, were failing him. He, a man who could command a room with a single sentence, was rendered speechless by a kiss. Isla saw his struggle, the internal war between his ingrained discipline and the overwhelming tide of emotion he was clearly feeling. This powerful, enigmatic man was just as lost in this uncharted territory as she was. Instead of speaking, he reached for her again, more gently this time. His hands framed her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones with a reverence that made her heart ache. "I have no right," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Your life is in chaos because of me living here, dependent on me." The words were a stark contrast to the fire she had just felt in his kiss, a sudden intrusion of logic and guilt into a moment of pure, unadulterated feeling. "Don't," Ayla interrupted, her voice surprisingly firm. She placed her hands over his, pressing his palms more firmly against her skin. "Don't analyze this. Not now." For the first time, she was the one taking control, guiding the emotional tenor of the moment. She looked directly into his eyes, willing him to see past the circumstances of their meeting, past the disparity in their wealth and status. "What just happened between us? It had nothing to do with gratitude or dependence, and you know it." Her directness seemed to break through his hesitation. A look of profound relief washed over his face, as if she had given him permission to feel what he was feeling. "I know," he admitted, his voice low and intense. He confessed that from the moment he heard her sing at the piano, something inside him had shifted. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, his money, his influence, his name. But she, with her fierce pride and her soulful music, had wanted nothing but to be seen for who she was. And in seeing her, he had begun to feel seen himself. It was a confession that mirrored her own feelings so perfectly it left her breathless. He wasn't just a savior. He was a man with his own deep-seated loneliness, a man who had been just as lost as she was, albeit in a different kind of storm. The chasm between their worlds, which had once seemed so vast and insurmountable, suddenly felt insignificant, a mere circumstantial detail in the face of the powerful, elemental connection they shared. Their souls, it seemed, spoke the same language. He promised himself in that moment that he would protect what they had just found, no matter how complicated their lives were about to become. The days that followed the kiss were a dreamlike blur of discovery. A new, tender intimacy bloomed in the sterile, opulent spaces of the penthouse, filling the rooms with a warmth and life they had never known before. The polite distance was gone, replaced by easy touches, lingering glances, and conversations that stretched late into the night. Isla discovered the man behind the imposing facade, a man with a dry, wicked sense of humor, a surprising passion for classic films, and a deep appreciation for the simple beauty she brought into his life. Connor, in turn, was utterly captivated by Ayla. He found himself rushing home from his mysterious high-pressure job, eager to hear the sound of her laughter or the soft melody of her humming as she scribbled lyrics in her journal. He, a man whose life was scheduled down to the minute, began to cherish the spontaneous, unstructured moments with her. She was teaching him how to live outside the rigid lines he had drawn for himself, how to find joy in the imperfect and the unplanned. His perfectly ordered world was now beautifully, irrevocably chaotic. Their passion was a quiet, constant flame. While they moved slowly, respecting the unspoken boundaries of their new relationship, the sensual tension was always there, a current running just beneath the surface. It was in the way his hand would linger on her waist as he passed her in the kitchen, the way she would bite her lip when she caught him watching her, the deep, soulful kisses they shared, filled with a promise of a deeper intimacy to come. The closed door of the guest suite became a silent symbol of the future they were hesitantly, hopefully, moving toward. One evening, he came home to find she had filled the living room with candles and was playing a soft, romantic melody on the piano. She had prepared a simple dinner, their second one together, and they ate on a blanket on the floor surrounded by candlelight, the glittering city a backdrop to their private world. It was in these moments that Ayla saw the full extent of his loneliness. He confessed he had never done this before, had never had someone create a home for him within the walls of his house. His life had been a series of acquisitions, not experiences. The disparity in their wealth, which had once been a source of such anxiety for Ayla, began to fade into the background. She realized his money was a part of him, but it did not define him. What defined him was his fierce integrity, his hidden well of tenderness, and the profound sense of safety she felt when she was with him. He, in turn, was not in love with a project or a charity case. He was in love with her spirit, her talent, and the unwavering strength that had carried her through the storm. Yet a shadow lingered at the edges of their idyllic bubble. Ayla knew with a growing sense of unease that she still knew almost nothing about his professional life. He spoke of the office, at cases and long hours, but the details were always vague, shrouded in a deliberate opacity. She saw the name Martinez on his mail, but she had never connected it to anything. She was in love with Connor, the man who had saved her, the man who made her feel cherished and alive. She was blissfully unaware that she was falling for one of the most powerful and influential public figures in the entire city. The first hint of Connor's other life came unexpectedly. He had to work from home one Saturday, and Ayla found herself trying to be quiet, respectful of the intense focus he brought to his tasks. She brought him a cup of coffee in his home office, a room she had rarely entered. It was as imposing as the rest of the penthouse, lined with shelves of thick leather-bound books. His desk was a wide expanse of polished mahogany, covered in neat stacks of documents and legal pads filled with his sharp, decisive handwriting. As she set the coffee down, her eyes fell upon a document he was reviewing. It was a legal brief of some kind, dense with formal, impenetrable language, but it wasn't the text that caught her eye. It was the letterhead at the top. Emblazoned in elegant official script were the words, "Office of the Honorable Judge Connor Martinez, Federal Circuit Court." The words seemed to leap off the page, rearranging themselves in her mind into a shocking, unbelievable new reality. Judge the Honorable. Ayla froze, her hand hovering over the desk. Judge Martinez. She had heard the name before, of course. Judge Martinez was a legend in the city, a famously private, almost reclusive figure known for his razor-sharp intellect, his immense family wealth, and his uncompromising, tough-on-crime reputation in the courtroom. He was a pillar of the establishment, a man who wielded immense power, a man whose decisions shaped lives and destinies. She stared at Connor, who was so engrossed in his work he hadn't noticed her reaction. Could this quiet, tender, lonely man who held her in the dark after a nightmare be that Judge Martinez? The idea was so preposterous, so utterly surreal that she almost laughed. But as she looked at him, really looked at him, the authoritative posture, the intense analytical focus, the air of quiet command he carried so naturally, the pieces began to click into place with a terrifying, sickening certainty. It explained everything. The need for privacy, the immense wealth, the controlled demeanor, the vague references to his work. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a federal judge, a man who sat in judgment of others. A cold dread began to seep into her veins, chilling the warmth of their newfound love. She felt a chasm opening up between them, a vast, unbridgeable divide not just of wealth but of power, class, and public scrutiny. She was a nightclub singer, an artist who lived by her emotions. He was a pillar of the law, a man who lived by facts and statutes. The thought of their relationship, so new and fragile, being exposed to the harsh, judgmental glare of the world he inhabited, was terrifying. She felt like an imposter, a fraud in his life. She backed away from the office door slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. He looked up, his focus broken by her sudden movement, a questioning look on his face. She forced a small, weak smile, mumbling something about letting him work. She needed to be alone. She needed to think. Her world had just been turned upside down for the second time in as many months. She had been rescued by a kind, wealthy man, only to discover he was a king, and she was a commoner who had wandered into his castle by mistake. She loved him, but she suddenly felt she didn't know him at all. The following days were a torment for Ayla. She moved through her idyllic life in the penthouse with a heavy heart, the knowledge of Connor's identity, a secret, thorny wall between them. Every tender touch, every shared laugh, every soulful kiss was now tainted by her awareness of the immense power he wielded, the public life he kept so carefully hidden from her. She felt like she was living a lie, loving a man whose full reality she wasn't a part of. The easy intimacy they had built felt fragile, threatened by a world she couldn't begin to comprehend. She watched him now with new eyes, seeing the judge in the man. She saw the way he listened to her, his head tilted in the same thoughtful, analytical way she had seen in news photos of him on the bench. She saw the weight of his responsibilities in the tired lines around his eyes when he came home late. The burden of a man who held people's futures in his hands. The protective hero who had saved her from the rain was also a man who sent people to prison. The contradiction was staggering, and it unsettled her to her core. She knew she couldn't continue like this, with the unspoken truth poisoning the beautiful thing they were building. She had to give him the chance to tell her himself. One evening, she decided to create an opening. They were sitting on the sofa, a comfortable silence between them as they watched the city lights. "You work so hard," she began, her voice carefully neutral. "And you're so private about it. I feel like I know so little about such a huge part of your life." She held her breath, hoping he would take the bait, that he would finally let her in. Connor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned to her, his gaze searching. "My work is complicated," he said, his voice laced with a familiar note of evasion. "It's demanding and often unpleasant. I don't want to bring it into this space. Into our space, what we have here," he gestured around the room, but she knew he meant the two of them, "is separate. It's my sanctuary." His words, meant to be reassuring, had the opposite effect. He wasn't just being private. He was actively compartmentalizing his life, and she was in the box labeled sanctuary, separate from his reality. The pain of that realization was a sharp, physical ache in her chest. He wasn't sharing his life with her. He was escaping it with her. The thought that he might be ashamed of her, that a nightclub singer didn't fit into the world of the Honorable Judge Connor Martinez, began to take root in her mind, a toxic, insidious weed. Was she just a beautiful, temporary distraction from his high-stakes life? A pleasant secret he kept locked away in his ivory tower? His reluctance to be honest with her felt like a betrayal of the intimacy they had shared. She had sung her soul to him on a public stage, bared her deepest fears to him in the dead of night. She had given him her trust and her heart. And in return, he was giving her a carefully edited, incomplete version of himself. The slow-burn romance, the forced proximity, all of it suddenly felt less like fate and more like a carefully managed situation, with him in complete control. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her laptop, a feeling of dread mixing with a desperate need for the whole truth. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, Ayla typed Judge Connor Martinez into the search engine. The results flooded the screen, a tidal wave of information that confirmed her deepest fears and painted a portrait of a man she barely recognized. There were articles from prestigious legal journals dissecting his landmark rulings, profiles in society magazines detailing the Martinez family's centuries-old legacy of wealth and power, and paparazzi photos of him at charity galas, always alone, always looking stern and untouchable. She read about his reputation, the Iron Judge, one headline called him. He was known for his fierce intellect, his low tolerance for legal theatrics, and his unshakable adherence to the letter of the law. He was respected, feared, and famously private, a man who had never given a personal interview, his life outside the courtroom a complete enigma. This was the man the world knew, a figure of immense intimidating authority. How could this be the same man who listened to her sing with tears in his eyes? The most painful discovery was an old Society page article about a charity event from a year ago. It mentioned his brief rumored engagement to a woman from a similarly powerful family, a corporate lawyer, with a pedigree as impressive as his own. The engagement had been quietly called off, the article speculated, because she couldn't handle the intense scrutiny and the rigid constraints of his life. If a woman from his own world couldn't handle it, what chance did she, Ayla Bennett, a woman with no family, no money, and a job that involved singing sad songs to strangers, possibly have? She felt a chasm open up, not just between their social statuses, but between their fundamental realities. His world was one of legacy, power, and public judgment. Her world was one of ephemeral beauty, emotional expression, and hand-to-mouth survival. He hadn't just omitted his job title. He had hidden an entire universe from her. The sense of deception was suffocating. She felt like a fool, a naive girl who had fallen for a fairy tale, only to find out the prince was a king with a kingdom she could never be a part of. Just then she heard his key in the door. She quickly closed the laptop, her face pale, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. He walked in, his expression tired from a long day, but it softened into a warm smile when he saw her. "There you are," he said, his voice filled with an affection that now felt like a lie. He moved to kiss her, but she instinctively turned her head and his lips met her cheek. He froze, sensing the sudden glacial shift in the atmosphere between them. "Ayla, what is it?" he asked, his smile vanishing, replaced by a look of deep concern. She couldn't speak. She could only look at him, at the man she loved who was also a complete and total stranger. The trust that had been the bedrock of their fragile relationship had been shattered into a million pieces. The silence between them was no longer filled with longing and possibility, but with the cold, hard weight of the truth. She had to know why he had hidden who he was, even if the answer would break her heart completely. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Ayla turned to face him, the laptop on the coffee table a silent accuser between them. "I know who you are, Connor," she said, her voice quiet but steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside her. "Or I should say I know who the world thinks you are. The Honorable Judge Martinez," she said his title with a bitter, ironic emphasis, and she saw him flinch, his composure finally cracking. A look of profound regret, mixed with something that looked like fear, crossed his face. "Ayla, let me explain," he began, taking a step toward her, his hands outstretched. She held up a hand, stopping him. "Explain what?" she asked, the hurt finally bleeding into her voice. "Explain why you lied to me? Or why you omitted the single most important fact about your life? Did you think I was too simple to understand? Or were you just ashamed to be seen with a nightclub singer? Was I just a pleasant diversion?" The questions tumbled out, each one laced with the pain of her insecurity and his deception. "No, of course not," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "It was never about that. It was the opposite." He looked desperate, his usual control completely gone. "My entire life people have seen the title, the name, the money. They don't see the man. They approach me with an agenda, with expectations, with fear. I am not a person to them. I am an institution. The night I met you, you were just you. You needed help. And you looked at me like I was just a man." He explained that he had been so captivated by her spirit, by her lack of pretense, that he had been terrified to shatter that by revealing the weight of his public identity. "I wanted you to see me," he pleaded, his voice cracking with vulnerability. "Connor, just Connor. The man who loves the sound of your voice and the way you get flour on your nose when you cook. I've never had that before." I was a coward. I was afraid that the moment you knew, you would start to look at me differently, that you would leave. His confession, so raw and honest, chipped away at the icy wall of her anger, but the hurt remained. "So you chose to deceive me instead?" she countered, her voice trembling. "You built this beautiful thing between us on a foundation of lies. How can I trust anything now? How do I know that this isn't just another part of your carefully controlled, compartmentalized life? The part where you get to play at being a normal man with a normal girl before you go back to your real world?" The argument was raw, painful, and stripped them both bare. She hurled her insecurities at him, and he countered with the crushing weight of his lifelong loneliness. They were two people from opposite ends of the universe who had found a common ground, only to have the realities of their worlds tear it apart. The love between them was undeniable, a powerful magnetic force in the room, but the breach of trust felt like a fatal wound. Finally, exhausted and heartbroken, Ayla knew what she had to do. "I can't be here," she whispered, tears finally streaming down her face. "I can't be your secret, and I can't live in a world where I don't even know who the man I'm sleeping with really is." The words hung in the air, a devastating final blow. She turned and walked toward the bedroom, the room that had been her sanctuary, to pack the few things that were actually hers. He didn't try to stop her, but stood frozen, the picture of a man who had just lost the only real thing in his entire gilded life. Packing was a swift, brutal affair. The beautiful clothes Connor had bought for her felt like a costume she could no longer wear. She left them folded neatly on the bed, taking only the few simple outfits she had purchased herself, her journal, and the worn sheet music for a song she had started writing about a man who found her in the rain. Each item was a painful reminder of the dream she had been living, a dream that had just shattered into a million pieces. When she emerged from the room with a small bag, Connor was still standing in the same spot, his face a mask of pale, hollow despair. He looked at the bag in her hand, and the reality of what was happening seemed to finally hit him with its full devastating force. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice hoarse. It was a practical question from a man who always thought in terms of solutions, but it was laced with a deep, personal agony. "I'll figure it out," she replied, her voice cold, though it was taking every ounce of her strength not to break down. "I always have." She walked toward the elevator, the private entrance that had once seemed so magical, now feeling like the escape hatch from a beautiful prison. "Ayla, don't do this," he pleaded, finally moving, crossing the vast room in a few long strides to stand before her, blocking her path. "We can fix this. I'll do anything. I'll tell the world I don't care. Just please, don't leave me." The desperation in his voice was a knife in her heart. This powerful, controlled man was begging, stripped of all his pride and authority. But the wound was too deep, the deception too profound. She needed space. She needed to breathe air that wasn't perfumed with his wealth and his secrets. "The problem isn't the world, Connor," she said, her voice breaking. "It's us. It's that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. Love can't be built on that." With a final, heartbreaking look into his devastated eyes, she stepped around him and pressed the button for the elevator. The ride down was an eternity of silent, racking sobs. She stepped out into the cold, impersonal lobby and didn't look back, walking out into the night, back into the world where she was on her own. For the next few days, Connor was a ghost in his own life. The penthouse, once filled with the sound of her music and laughter, was now a silent, echoing mausoleum. Every room held a memory of her. He saw her at the piano, her eyes closed in concentration. He smelled the phantom scent of garlic and basil in the kitchen. He saw her reflection in the vast windows overlooking the city. Her absence was a physical presence, a gaping wound in the heart of his perfect, empty life. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, and in doing so he had pushed out the only person who had ever made it feel like a home. Ayla, meanwhile, found refuge on the couch of a friend from the club. She threw herself into her music, pouring all of her heartbreak and disillusionment into her songs. Her performances at the Azure Club took on a new, raw intensity. She sang of love, loss, and betrayal with such authentic, gut-wrenching emotion that the audiences were left breathless and teary-eyed. She was channeling her pain into her art, the only way she knew how to survive. But every night, when the music stopped and she was alone with her thoughts, the ache of Connor's absence was a constant, throbbing pain. She missed the man, not the judge. She missed the way he listened to her, the quiet safety of his presence, the surprising tenderness in his touch. She had run from his world, but she couldn't outrun the truth of her own heart. She was still completely, hopelessly in love with him. She had chosen her pride over her love, and the loneliness of that choice was a bitter pill to swallow. He realized, standing alone in his silent penthouse, that all his power and wealth meant nothing if he couldn't have the one thing he truly wanted: her. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. It was raining again, a soft, steady drizzle that mirrored the melancholy in Connor's soul. He was sitting in the dark, staring at the grand piano, a silent monument to the music and life that had vanished from his home. He had spent the past week in a state of numb, functional misery. Going through the motions of his high-powered life, his focus shattered, his judgment clouded by the constant, aching memory of Ayla. He had respected her need for space, but his restraint was eroding with every passing. Silent hour. He finally admitted the truth to himself. His fear of her leaving hadn't been about his title. It had been about his own unworthiness. He had never felt that a woman could love him, the man separate from his name and his fortune. His deception wasn't a betrayal of her, but a betrayal of himself, a capitulation to his deepest insecurities. And in trying to protect himself from a perceived rejection, he had created the very reality he feared. He had lost her. He couldn't let that be the end of their story. He would not. He grabbed his keys and jacket, a man on a mission, driven by a clarity he hadn't felt in days. He knew where she would be. He drove not to her friend's apartment, but to the Azure Club. He walked in, his presence immediately drawing stares. The Honorable Judge Martinez did not frequent dimly lit jazz lounges. He ignored the whispers, his eyes scanning the room until he found her, a solitary, luminous figure in the spotlight on stage. She was singing a new song, a heartbreakingly beautiful melody filled with a sorrow so profound it silenced the entire room. He listened to the words, and his heart broke all over again. She was singing about him, about a man who was a quiet port in a storm, a man who lived in a glass tower, a man who held her heart and then let it fall. It was her side of the story, her pain laid bare for all to see. He waited until the last sorrowful note faded, and the room erupted in applause. As she took a bow, her eyes misty with unshed tears, she saw him. He was standing at the back of the room, soaked from the rain, his gaze locked on hers. She finished her set in a daze, her mind reeling. When she came off stage, he was there, waiting for her in the wings. "Ayla," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Before she could protest or run, he laid his soul bare. "You were right. I was a coward. I hid behind my title because I was terrified that the man underneath it wasn't enough. But these last few days without you, they have been the emptiest of my life. My world, my power, my name. It's all just a silent, empty room without you in it. I don't want to be a judge without you. I don't want to be anything without you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring but a single, simple key. "This isn't a key to my penthouse," he said, his voice trembling as he pressed it into her hand. "It's the key to my home. It's nothing without you there to make it one. I love you, Ayla, not as a secret, not as an escape. I love you, all of you, and I want to build a real life with you, no matter how messy or public or complicated it gets. Please, come home." The rain was falling outside just as it had on the night they met, but this time it wasn't a storm of loss. It was a promise of renewal. She looked from the key in her hand to the desperate, hopeful, loving face of the man before her. Not the judge, not the billionaire, but Connor. Her Connor, and in that moment, she knew that home wasn't a place. It was him. She threw her arms around his neck and met his lips in a soul-deep kiss, a kiss of forgiveness, of reunion, and of a love that was stronger than any secret. If this story touched you, don't leave without subscribing. Your support means everything. Hit the bell so you never miss the next luxury romance, and tell me in the comments, from which country are you watching tonight? I can't wait to know.